July 1937. High above the west coast of the United States, a strange foreign aircraft appears in the sky. For the first time, American airspace has been penetrated by an airplane flying non-stop from communist Russia. This is the story of how Soviet designers of the World War II era worked in secret to create amazing planes that were ahead of the rest of the world. Flying submarines, flying tanks, ramjet fighters, and invisible aircraft. And how they worked as slaves in prison camps, facing daily torture at the hands of the psychotic mass murderer who ruled Soviet Russia, Joseph Stalin. Under the threat of death, and in spite of overwhelming fear, Soviet designers beat the odds, turning out ingenious revolutionary planes that would change aviation history. In 1937, a Russian plane flies non-stop from Moscow over the North Pole to Pearson Field, Washington State, a distance of 7,000 miles. The pilot is Valery Chkalov. His flight shocks America. No one had any warning that the aircraft was even heading toward the coast. The flight caps years of top-secret aviation design, led by ruthless dictator Joseph Stalin.
In the 1930s, Stalin felt that the Russian motherland was surrounded by capitalist enemies. His solution was to build up Russia's military and industrial power. In particular, he was interested in new technologies such as aviation.
Stalin spent a lot of the national treasury to expand his aviation sector, building aircraft, setting up design bureaus, and also experimenting with new and radical designs. And during this era, he built a number of large aircraft, bombers in particular, which gave the Soviet Union the potential of having a striking power in terms of aviation.
Chkalov becomes an overnight sensation in the U.S. He meets Shirley Temple and General George C. Marshall, who will lead America's forces in the coming World War. But behind closed doors, it's a different story. An angry President Roosevelt will ask Marshall how the Soviets have developed a plane capable of striking at American cities. The surprise flight would have far-reaching consequences for U.S. aviation.
The Soviet flight was to change United States military history. Congress was on the point of cancelling the B-17 Flying Fortress, the early prototypes of which had crashed. But when they saw what the Russians could do in terms of long-range bombers, they realized America had to have its own B-17.
The amazing Russian aircraft that has flown to America is called the Ant-25. It has a wingspan of over 110 feet, wider than the U-2 skyplane of the Cold War era. And it is capable of staying in the air for an incredible 2.5 days at a time. Its secret is the long wings, which give it maximum fuel efficiency, also contain the fuel tanks themselves. The fuel makes up 1/3 of the aircraft's total takeoff weight. The designer of this revolutionary aircraft is Andrei Tupolev.
Andrei Tupolev was an interesting man. In the course of the 1920s, he emerges as the Soviet Union's premier aircraft designer.
Yet Tupolev began his career with a very different sort of vehicle. He invented the world's first aerosled, an incredibly practical device for the Russian climate. In future years, he would use aerosleds to test aircraft engines. Under Tupolev's leadership, a band of brilliant new Russian aircraft designers began to emerge. At first, Stalin was happy to use their work as propaganda for the new Soviet state. They developed the world's most advanced aircraft technology in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Their first successful aircraft was the world's first flying wing. The Bich-3 was a revolutionary tailless aircraft with a huge parabola wing configuration. It first flew in 1926 and would inspire a generation of designers. One of these was Alexander Moskalev. In 1933, the year Hitler comes to power, Moskalev made a breakthrough that was a generation ahead of the rest of the world. He draws up plans for a delta-winged supersonic fighter called the SAM-4 Sigma.
Alexander Moskalev is a lesser-known Soviet aircraft designer in the 1930s. One of the things he stumbled across, and he used for rather practical reasons, was the delta wing design, which was a radical innovation for the 1930s.
Moskalev wasn't afraid to be completely radical in his design approach. And he had an idea that if you could do away with the regular tailplane, that's the horizontal stabilizer in the United States, you would have a better aeroplane because it would weigh less, it would have less drag.
A prototype of the Sigma flew in 1936 with a propeller engine. But Moskalev isn't finished. He begins to develop a rocket motor for a supersonic version. In effect, Moskalev envisions the first aircraft in the world to break the sound barrier. It is a quest that would obsess the young designer through World War II.
The design of the Sigma was perfect for supersonic flight. All he lacked at that time was a powerful enough rocket motor.
The huge strides the Russians make in aviation technology come as a shock in the West when they are revealed in combat for the first time during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. Stalin rushes hundreds of the latest Soviet fighter planes to aid the embattled left-wing government against a fascist rising led by General Franco. It is called the I-16, nicknamed the Rat. The new plane looks utterly different from contemporary fighters, which have not changed design since the First World War. It is a monoplane rather than a biplane. It is built for speed and flies 70 miles per hour faster than any other fighter.
The I-16, which first flew in 1934, was the first in the world of the new species of monoplane fighter, streamlined with retractable landing gear and guns in the wings. Everywhere you looked, it was new.
But now, something happens that destroys Russia's lead in aviation.
Beginning in 1937, Stalin presided over a series of show trials in which prominent figures in Soviet life, civil and military, were accused of some outrageous acts of sabotage and treason. Two Soviet Air Force commanders, for example, were arrested and executed in the late 30s. And Andrei Tupolev, the great Soviet designer, was also arrested and sent to prison.
Tupolev and his associates are carted off to the infamous Lubyanka prison in Moscow, where they are tortured and forced to sign false confessions.
The stock charge was that they had betrayed their trust by selling secret aeroplane designs to somewhere in America or Britain. It was nonsense, but the attitude of Stalin and his henchmen was people work better if they are really scared.
One trumped-up charge against Tupolev is that his famous Ant-25 flight to America was a cover to smuggle blueprints of the latest Soviet aircraft out of Russia to sell to Nazi Germany.
He put them all in prison. He actually created prison camps where the aircraft engineers could go on designing their aircraft, but be under the watchful eye of the Soviet Secret Service.
One of Alexander Solzhenitsyn's most famous novels is called The First Circle, in which he uses imaginative literature to capture one of the most unusual aspects of the Stalinist purges, the police special prison workshops. And these were set up in the 1930s, in which scientists and aircraft designers were technically under arrest, but set up in these special workshops under guard, where they worked on high priority projects for the Soviet Union.
They work because their families will be arrested and shot if they do not obey. Guards constantly follow the engineers around the workshops.
It was like living in the Bastille. You had good food, you even had waitresses, you had cigarettes, you had certain amenities, you slept in clean beds, but you never knew when, if ever, you would get out. You just didn't know what ultimately your fate would be.
Yet neither Stalin nor his designers had any inkling how crucially their work would affect their country and world history. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German troops and 3,300 tanks smashed through the Russian border. This is Operation Barbarossa, Adolf Hitler's attempt to annihilate communist Russia.
The first target of Operation Barbarossa was the Soviet Air Force. And on the morning of June 22, 1941, the German Luftwaffe attacked forward airfields of the Soviet Union, and huge numbers of Soviet aircraft were destroyed in place.
The largest air force in the world is wiped out in a single day. What